Hello and welcome to Chapter 11, Education. Today we're going to look at education. What is the purpose of education? Also, what are some of the issues that may affect students in their education? First, let's have a quick overview of education. Education is the social institution responsible for the systematic transmission of knowledge, skills, and cultural values within a formally organized structure. Formal education is learning that takes place within an academic setting, such as a school, which has a planned instructional process and teachers who convey specific knowledge, skills, and thinking processes to students. Meanwhile, informal education is the learning that occurs in a spontaneous, unplanned way, like storytelling by grandparents. Compared to informal education, formal education is usually structured, it is usually well planned, and it is usually standardized throughout a country. Meanwhile, informal education is usually what we learn at home and outside, usually from our parents or relatives or even our friends. One of the biggest difference between formal and informal education is that usually at the end of your formal education, you have some kind of graduation and you get some kind of certificate or a diploma. This is to certify that you are ready to proceed to the next step, such as secondary school or college or university. So, what is the purpose of education? Lester Frank Ward, the first president of the American Sociological Society, believed that the main purpose of education was to equalize society. The source of inequality was unequal distribution of knowledge. The main purpose of education was to equalize society by diffusing knowledge to all. Now, looking back at the previous chapter, why do some people belong in the upper class of society while others belong in the lower class of society? Could a good education give opportunities to someone who would normally not get such opportunities? For example, if a student from a poor family works very hard, studies very hard, and scores well for their exam, would he or she be able to move upwards in the social ladder? Whether you come from a poor or a rich family, getting good results will often give you the opportunity to go into a good university, which will in turn give you opportunities to take on jobs that you would normally not be able to get. This will of course give you the opportunity to have a better life for yourself and your family. Functionalists stress the importance of education in socializing the young, transmitting the culture, and developing skills. According to functionalists, education is one of the strongest determinants of one's future. Getting a good education is one of the most important aspects of getting a good job. Meanwhile, conflict theorists note that education preserves class distinctions, maintains social control, and promotes inequality. In many countries, including Malaysia, the quality of education that you have highly depends on the amount of money that you have. Wealthier families can afford to send their children to after-school tuition classes, private schools, or even international schools. This can have a big effect on the quality of education that they receive. Here, functionalists list out the manifest and latent functions of education. We are going to look at socialization, cultural transmission, academic skills, innovation, childcare, and postponing job hunting. Now, just in case you forget what manifest and latent functions are, here's a quick recap from Chapter 1. Manifest functions refers to the intended and recognized consequences of a process. In other words, the manifest function refers to the intentional steps or reason for a certain action. Meanwhile, latent functions refers to unintended or not readily recognized consequences of such processes. Latent functions refers to the extra side effects or the bonus results of a certain action. First up, we look at socialization, which is a manifest function. There is a need for a formal education system to extend socialization process beyond the family. This is to ensure that students learn the same things, the important things, such as language, math and science, even history, in order to function in society. Cultural transmission, which is seen as a latent function, sometimes manifest. Major portions of society's knowledge are passed from one generation to the next. As students, we learn by observing the world around us, based on what we see from our friends, our teachers, and the other people in our environment. We learn what is seen as good and acceptable, and what is seen as bad and unacceptable in society. Academic skills, which is a manifest function. What are some of the useful academic skills that children pick up in school? One of the most important skills to learn in school is, of course, language. The language that we use to communicate in our everyday life. With every language that you learn, whether it be Malay, English, Mandarin, Tamil, French, German, Spanish, Japanese, or Korean, you become a more useful member of society. In primary and secondary school, we also learn a little bit about mathematics and science and the arts. We get a good grasp on the subjects that we like, the skills that we are good at, so that we have a much better idea on what to do in the next stage of our life, whether it be going to college or entering into the workforce. Innovation, which can be a manifest or even a latent function. Primary task of educational institutions is to transmit society's knowledge, and part of that knowledge consists of the means by which new knowledge is to be sought. Learning how to think independently and creatively is probably one of the most valuable tools the educational institution can transmit. Other than memorizing words and formulas, what else do we learn from school? Are we encouraged to think independently and creatively, come up with new inventions and ideas that are not found in the textbook or syllabus? Activities such as sports, extracurricular activities, seminars, and even discussions teach us skills such as leadership, teamwork, communication, and even presentation skills. We also learn more from the people around us who may come from different cultural backgrounds. This will help us function better and create a more harmonious environment between ourselves and the people around us. Next, we have childcare, which is seen as a latent function. One latent function of many public schools is to provide childcare outside the nuclear family. Now, this is especially true for small children and young teenagers. Where do you go when your parents are not around to take care of you? One of the functions of school is to take care of the children while the parents are at work. Children are encouraged to participate in after-school activities such as sports or clubs and societies. This helps children discover their talent, make new friends, and even stay out of trouble. Finally, we look at postponing job hunting, which is a latent function. More and more young adults are choosing to continue their education after graduating from high school. Now, of course, we have a choice to go straight into the workforce after completing secondary school. But most parents today choose to send their kids into colleges or universities. This is to ensure that they get a more advanced education and to graduate with a diploma or a degree to ensure that they get a much better job in the future. On the other hand, conflict theorists have a very different view on education. According to conflict theorists, one of the functions of education is tracking. This is the placing of students to specific curriculum groups and courses on the basis of their test scores, previous grades, or other criteria. Conflict theorists suggest that tracking seriously affects many students' overall performance. Conflict theorists suggest that putting the best performing students into A classes and putting the least performing students into F classes may not be the best way to do things. In reality, we work with different types of people. And by putting low performing students into F classes, how can you expect them to have the motivation to study or even to do better in their exams? Conflict theorists also say that education creates a credentialized society. This is basically a society where a degree or certificate has become necessary to perform a vast variety of jobs. However, credentials may not necessarily cause the recipient to perform the job better. Conflict theorists argue that education today is no longer about learning, but about graduating with that piece of paper, that diploma or degree that allows you to get a higher paying job. It also raises the question, just because you have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, does it make you perform better than someone who does not? This also gives employers an excuse to pay workers who do not have a good educational credentials a lower salary. Conflict theorists also argue that there is a hidden curriculum in our education system. Basically, social attitudes and values taught in school that prepare children to accept the requirements of adult life and to fit into social, political, and economic statuses the society provides. Basically, what this says is that schools brainwash our young children in order to accept their place in society. This is to ensure that they get used to our political, social, and economic systems so that when they grow up, they do not question it, even though it may be seen as unfair. Unequal access to education, inequality between social classes, financial aid. As mentioned before, wealthier families in most countries can afford to put their children into much better schools. This creates an inequality in our education system. What about those who cannot afford to take after-class tuitions or hire a private tutor? What about those who cannot afford to go to college? Although there are financial aids and scholarships around, it is not easy in today's society to get them. Poorer families frequently do not have the time or resources to give the children the good education that they need to achieve the exam results that they need to apply for these scholarships. Next up, we look at some of the issues found in education. Although most of this can be quite serious problems, some of them are actually good things that we don't necessarily know how to deal with. First up, we have funding of public schools. How do we ensure that public schools get the funding that they need? Some schools need more funding than others. In most developing countries, and even developed countries like the United States, public schools are frequently underfunded. In some countries, public schools get funding based on how well their students perform. In other words, the better their students, the more money that they get. So this brings up the issue. What about the worst performing students? What if some of these students are not doing well because they do not have the resources, the time, the money, the good teachers that they need in order to produce good students? Should we neglect certain schools just because they are not doing well? What about some schools who have issues like gang problems, bullying, or students who are so poor they cannot afford to buy their textbooks? This brings us to the next issue, which is school dropouts. When a student is not doing well, especially if they are poor, they have a high tendency to drop out from school. This creates a whole new set of problems because school dropouts have a much greater problem when it comes to looking for a job. School dropouts pay less in taxes because of their lower earnings. School dropouts increase the demand for social services, including welfare, medical assistance, and unemployment compensation. School dropouts are less likely to vote. School dropouts tend to have poorer health, and half of all state prison inmates did not complete high school. So you can clearly see that school dropouts create a lot of problems in society. Students drop out of school not because they want to, but frequently they are having problems with their class or even their fellow students. This problem can be solved, or at least made less severe, by hiring more teachers, by hiring better trained, qualified teachers who are equipped to deal with these problems, by having smaller classrooms so that teachers can pay more attention to each individual student. Racial segregation. Have you observed any form of racial segregation in education? In Malaysia, public universities and colleges have a quota system to ensure that a much higher percentage of Bumiputras get into their institution. This creates an imbalance where someone who may not have done the best in their exams but is allowed into these public institutions just because of their race. Meanwhile, we have some cases where non-Bumiputras who have scored straight A's but did not manage to get a position in these universities. As a result, especially for those who come from poorer families, they may have to take out heavy loans just to get an education into one of the private universities. Students with disabilities. What do we do with students who are having difficulty following the lesson? What about cases of bullying? There are some students who, because of their physical or mental disability, may not be able to follow the class like other students. They may also be subjected to bullying as they are seen as different from others. What do we do with these cases? Unfortunately, this is a case that not many people are willing to acknowledge. Which university would want to admit that they are not equipped to deal with students with disabilities? Which school or university is willing to admit that they have a bullying problem? Before you can solve a problem, you need to admit it. And after admitting to the problem, you need to have discussions and take steps in order to solve the problem. This frequently needs a lot of time, manpower, and resources. The next issue we look at is homeschooling. Even in Malaysia, we have private homeschooling centers where parents who do not wish to send their children to regular public schools or private schools send their kids. Do you believe that children who are homeschooled receive the same quality of education as those who attend school? There are three main reasons why parents choose homeschooling. First up, they may be concerned about the school environment. Schools around the world, whether it be public or private, suffer from different problems. This includes bullying, students with bad behavior, or gang issues. Parents who do not wish to expose their children to such an environment may choose to homeschool their kids. Secondly, to provide religious or moral instruction. Some parents who may not agree with the normal schooling system may choose instead to send their kids to institutions that focus more on religious teachings. In Malaysia, this includes Tafiz schools, Bible schools, or temple schools that focus a lot more on religious teachings. And finally, some parents may be dissatisfied with the academic instruction available at the regular schools. Some parents may not be happy with the education system and may choose to educate their children or send their children to education centers that uses the American, British, or Australian or other education systems, which they feel are better and more beneficial for their kids. Language issues, they are more likely to drop out. In countries with 2 languages or more, such as the United States, Canada, or even Malaysia, students with poor command of language, especially the language of instruction, may have difficulties understanding the lesson. This results in poor performance and stress for the student and increases the chances that they might drop out from school. Violence in schools. Students in some schools report being bullied both by teachers and students. Some students report having to carry a weapon to school. Screening and bag checks. Although this is a much more severe and serious case in the United States, where they have had a massive number of school shooting cases, almost every country in the world suffer from this problem. Most schools, whether it be public or private, suffer from some kind of bullying problem. As mentioned before, the biggest problem with bullying is that most people are not willing to admit it. No school is willing to admit that they have a bullying problem. And bullies, they don't think that they are bullying anyone. And victims, a lot of victims, they are just too scared to admit that they are being bullied. How can we solve a problem without recognizing and acknowledging it? Standardized testing. There is a lot of debate regarding standardized testing. Standardized testing like our UPSR, PT3 and SPM Do they really measure how smart or how good a student is? One might argue that the only things these exams test is our ability to memorize and repeat what the teacher has taught us. What about skills like critical thinking, communication, and presentation skills? What about students who get ill and do not perform well under stress? Can we really use the same standard of examination to test the performance of all students? And just because a student doesn't do well in his or her exam, does it mean that they are a bad student? Gender bias in the classroom. Who do you think is more likely to perform well in class? Who are more likely to fail? Based on exam results collected from all over the world, the scores clearly show that girls have a much higher tendency to score much better than boys. Why is this the case? Is there a condition or a mentality that causes girls to study harder than boys? Perhaps boys have the tendency to focus on other activities like sports or extracurricular activities. Or it could be just that girls are smarter than boys. What do we do with that information? Next up, we look at the gifted. What should be done with gifted students who progress much faster than other students? Are schools equipped to deal with such students? In almost every society, there tend to be about 5% of students who are gifted. These students have the ability to learn and master subjects much faster than any other student. They are usually seen as the smart kids or the ace kids. Now, what do we do with them? Should we allow them to skip certain grades or have special schools for them in order to develop their talent? And finally, we look at the high cost of education. Problems include unequal access to education leaving students in debt, and financial aid. Depending on the country that you're from, this may or may not be a problem. If you're from a country like Germany, Denmark, or Finland, where education is free, you may not have this problem. But in countries like Australia, Singapore, the United States, and the UK, education can be really expensive. Some students may be required to take out huge loans to settle their college tuition fee. In some countries, some students may spend the rest of their life paying off their college tuition. In conclusion, what do you think? Does our education system fulfill the needs of its students? What social needs does our education system meet? Does our schools and university teach us the necessary skills that we need to survive in society? What do you think should be the job of our education system? If the purpose of education is to educate and train, why do screening and tracking exist? Are exam results really that important? Should we segregate and separate students based on their exam results? What is your opinion about exams? Are they necessary? Do they fairly measure a student's performance and knowledge in a certain subject? The most common argument against tracking notes that tracking fosters race and class segregation. What do you think? Does segregation of students create discrimination or even racist issues? Does segregating and grouping students based on their exam results create discrimination or even racist issues? Are we preparing the current generation of students for the future? That's one of the biggest questions asked in society today. The argument is that the skills that we need 10 years from now may not even exist today. While some courses like mass communication and business have a tendency to focus on soft skills like presentation, interpersonal communication, and leadership skills, other courses focus more on hard skills like programming or technical skills. Is one more important than the other? Or should we spend more time trying to strike a balance between the two? What do you think? Is there any way we can improve our education system and create a better future for our students? That's something to think about. And that brings us to the end of our lecture. I'll see you next week.